The idea of prudence may sound like something old-fashioned, but I believe it's a virtue that deserves a fresh new look. Hi, I'm Father Kevin Zubel, and I'm a Redemptorist missionary stationed in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Years ago, I was working with a youth group, and we were talking about the different cardinal virtues of the Catholic Church. And so I asked the kids, what do you know about prudence? And there was silence, and then one of the kids raised their hands and said, well, my grandma's very, very sweet. And so I was like, no, I'm not talking about your grandma prudence. I'm talking about this virtue. But I think it is. I think it's an idea that we see as very, very old-fashioned. When we hear the word prudence, we think maybe of a Puritan housewife or something along those lines. But I think prudence is a virtue whose time has come. That in our own day and age, that prudence is a virtue we need to cultivate, that we need to ask God's help to develop and to grow. So what is prudence? Well, just in the way of example, I remember years ago I had a good friend who was raised and grew up in East Germany, behind the Berlin Wall. And I remember he told all these stories about how he and his family had to move around the very oppressive regime and the Stasi and all the secret police and all those sorts of things. And so I asked him, I said, that must have been incredibly difficult, always living in fear, always looking over your shoulder, always looking to see who's following you and things like that. And he just kind of laughed and he said, it's not about being afraid. It was about being prudent. It was about being smart, being street smart. And I love this definition of prudence as sort of almost like a spiritual street smartness, that this intelligence, this sort of applied wisdom, that we as people of faith can bring with us into the concrete reality of our lives. Prudence is one of the cardinal virtues taught by the Catholic faith, and it's part of the moral life. It's part of the way of trying to take all these things we hear of the teachings of God, of the wisdom of the church, and applying it intelligently and creatively in our own daily lives. One of the most beautiful discussions of prudence in the scriptures comes in the book of Proverbs. And if you've never read chapter 8 of the book of Proverbs, I highly recommend it. It's the Song of Wisdom, and it's one of the most beautiful poems that we have in our tradition. And in the 8th chapter of Psalms, wisdom sings her song. She invites people to join her in the work of creating with the Spirit. And so here in chapter 8, we read, take my instruction instead of silver, and knowledge rather than choice gold. For wisdom is better than jewels, and all that you may desire cannot compete with her. I, wisdom, live with prudence, and I attain knowledge and discretion. Prudence and wisdom work together to help us make good decisions, to help us guide others in the way of faith. And what I love about prudence is it really does speak to the here and now. It really speaks to the what if or the why of our faith and gets into the daily decision making that we encounter at work, at school, in business decisions, and in decisions about our daily life and how we manage our family and how we make decisions. And what I love about my friend's example from East Germany is the great gift of prudence is it helps us confront moments of crisis, moments of uncertainty, with something other than fear. And so when we think of prudence and we think of applied wisdom, we can look at some of the events we've been experiencing recently in our own time. We can think of the pandemic and how, especially in the early days of the pandemic, there was so much we didn't know. And we know a lot of people who were almost imprisoned by fear. And that's what the unknown can do. But what prudence invites us to do is invites us to take the wisdom of the ages, to look at our own history, and to look at what Christ has taught us by his own example and what the prophets have carried forward across the generations about how we can have faith in God and his promises, how we can have faith that the reign of God is at hand, that Christ is on his throne, and that we are headed towards a destiny that is lit up by resurrection. So here's some tips for developing a spirit of prudence and working with God to form this virtue in our own lives. The first is be curious. Be curious and open your mind and to learn and to be open to facts, and perhaps facts that we're not quite ready to accept. Listen to a range of voices and get good information, and not to be trapped in our own little bubbles or self-circulating or self-referential circles of ideology. To try and learn good information about the struggles we're facing. Be curious. Listen to others. Listen to your own heart. The second is be courageous. Be willing to take the risk, to speak out, to speak up. Be willing to stretch your own limits, to go where you haven't been before, so that you might develop this wisdom. You might be able to turn your knowledge and your own experience into a wealth of wisdom to draw on as you try to make good decisions about the future. And finally, be creative. Find new solutions to old problems. Try to have confidence that working together with the Holy Spirit, alongside those in your own community, that you'll find decisions, you'll find ways forward that perhaps weren't obvious to begin with. And trust that God blesses your work when you act with good intention and when you open your heart to him and open your heart to one another. So let's develop and pray for that gift and virtue of prudence. Be curious, be courageous, be creative, but above all, be ready to be surprised by what Christ will reveal to you from the wisdom of the ages.